There is a difference.
Welcome back to Classic Car Restoration. Now, we've nearly completed our engine assembly on our 62 Corvette Roadster. We've torqued the heads, we've installed the manifolds, we've even put on the fuel pump. We've detailed the valve covers. So now we're ready for the flywheel. Now, before we install our flywheel, it's critically important to make sure that this surface on the crankshaft is clean and free of all grit. 1 millimeter of grit there is going to equal about 1/4 of an inch out here. You're going to have an engine vibration. And here's our flywheel. The same thing. We get this mating surface very clean. Now remember, we marked our crankshaft with a stripe. That lines up with this extra hole. Right there. Now these are the flywheel bolts. I like to use thread locker on them. You want the blue kind, the medium strength. The red kind is permanent. You don't want that. We'll put a drop on each one. Right there. And again, we thread them up by hand. Make sure that we've got them. I wiggled that flywheel just a little bit to get them started. Good. Really smooth. With all the bolts in, I thread them down finger tight, working them in a star pattern around the flywheel. They're all even at about 12 or 15 pounds right now. Chevrolet wants us to take them to 60. So let's mark our torque wrench at 60. I torque each bolt to 60 pounds, going around the flywheel in a star pattern so that the flywheel is securely and evenly positioned on the crankshaft. All right, that completes the flywheel installation. Now we're ready to set our clutch disc and our pressure plate. Now before I set this clutch disc on here, I want you to notice this flywheel surface. We had this remachined. Remember before it had burn spots? The machinist took off about 6 1/1000ths. That got us down into the good material. This is the clutch disc. Now it's foolproof because they always print flywheel side. And that goes on like this. And in order to hold it, we take our handy little clutch tool. This comes in all the clutch packs. It's just an injection molded plastic version of the front of our input shaft on the transmission. So that slides right in, mates up with that, and then this goes in to the back of the crankshaft. That'll hold that there while I set the pressure plate. Many engines have locator studs to position the clutch, like we had on the cylinder heads. But instead, this Chevrolet has shouldered bolts that locate the holes in the pressure plate. Be careful not to lose these when you remove the clutch. Now, the other great thing about this plastic clutch tool is it allows us to locate our clutch disc before we nip down the pressure plate bolts. That way, when we install our transmission, it'll slide right in. Okay, it wants a little this way. I'm checking the disc with my fingertips and adjusting. Good, it's exactly centered. Now, I can start to nip down the pressure plate bolts. Again, tighten these down in a star pattern around the disc. As I tighten the bolts, the clutch diaphragm spring will retract. Finish tightening the bolts to about 25 foot-pounds of torque. All right, we've got our flywheel torqued down, our clutch disc is in there, and our pressure plate is torqued down. After the break, come back and join us where we'll put on the bell housing and the transmission. When we come back, restoration. Now we're in the home stretch of assembling our engine and transmission. We've set our flywheel, we've torqued our clutch pack, so now we're ready for the bell housing. Now this is such a simple little job, but it seems to trip up so many people. Here's a couple of key points to remember. There's a throw-out bearing arm pivot right here. We want to put a little grease on it. We'll do the same to our throw-out bearing arm. That'll give our clutch pedal that smooth new car feel. we've got to set this before we set our bell housing on. To do that, we'll go right through here, and I'm fitting that pivot ball right between those forks. That's it. Second thing to remember, make sure you get this surface very clean. Any grit or residue will throw this out of alignment, and it'll throw your transmission out of alignment. You'll have a bit of a bind when you find first or second gear. Good and clean. Now Chevrolet has provided us with a couple of locator pins like they did on our cylinder heads. Makes it easy. There's the one and the other. Good. Lubricate the bell housing bolts and put them in through the housing. Hand tighten the bolts, again in a star pattern, to about 15 pounds. And then go back and finish them to about 25 pounds, good and snug. Now the last important part of the bell housing installation is the throwout bearing itself. This rides on the front of the transmission extension, and we've got to put a little bit of grease in this well right here. Grease both the inside and the outside of the throwout bearing. Not too much, just a thin layer. Then gently walk it on to the throwout bearing arm. There are two little clips that'll hold it in place. And that's the tricky part. That's got to stay there, and we'll align it with our arm as we bring in our transmission front snout. All right, we're ready to install our little 4-speed now. We've got good smooth surface here and here. We've cleaned it here, so we're going to take this and snake it in. But first I want to show you a couple little tricks. Make sure your splines are good and dry and clean. The other thing I want you to do is put a light smear of grease on this. This goes right into the pilot bearing. Right here, this will lubricate the slider on the throwout bearing. And then the last place, right here. That'll help us mate to the bell housing. The installation of the transmission is a little tricky, so I get some extra hands and help from my friend, restoration mechanic Roger Schmidt. Roger and I carefully snake the transmission snout all the way into the throwout bearing, through the clutch disc, and into the pilot bearing. While Roger supports the back of the transmission, I tighten some of the pilot bolts to secure it. And then we continue to walk the transmission in, tightening the bolts as we get the transmission seated. Once the transmission is all the way in and secure, we can put in the bottom bolts and lock washers. And then we'll remove the top pilot bolts and replace them, adding the lock washers. A final tightening with a hand wrench takes these down to about 30 pounds of torque. All right, we've got our 4-speed installed. Our engine and transmission assembly is done, and we've reached a real milestone here because finally we're on the way back uphill with our restoration. We're ready to put this into our newly